Organized crime isn't just a chapter in history books. It's the shadow that shaped cities, controlled politics, and turned gangsters into household names. Hollywood gave us The Godfather and Goodfellas, but the real stories were darker, bloodier, and far more dangerous. These men weren't just criminals. They were architects of empires, kings without crowns, ruling the underworld with fear, money, and betrayal. From Chicago to New York, their names carved scars across America. Al Capone, the smiling face of Prohibition chaos. Lucky Luciano, the mastermind who turned gangs into corporations. Carlo Gambino, the silent ruler who dominated without ever lifting his voice. John Gotti, the Dapper Don who loved the cameras as much as the crime. Frank Costello, the prime minister who bought more power with envelopes than bullets. And Vito Genovese, the tyrant whose ambition drowned the Mafia in blood. This isn't fiction. This is the rise and fall of the most famous Mafia bosses in history. Each one carried the same title, but each one redefined what that meant. And it all begins in Chicago during the wild days of Prohibition, with the man the world still knows as Scarface. Chicago 1920s, a city roaring with jazz, booze, and bullets. When the US government banned alcohol, they didn't just start a moral crusade, they created an opportunity, and no one seized it better than Alphonse Capone. To the newspapers, he was public enemy number one. To the poor, he was Robin Hood. But to his rivals, he was a nightmare dressed in a tailored suit. Capone wasn't born into wealth. He grew up on the streets of Brooklyn, learning early that fists and fear got you further than honesty ever would. By his 20s, he was working for Johnny Torrio, a mobster who brought him west to Chicago. When Torrio stepped back after a near-death ambush, Capone, just 26 years old, inherited the empire. Overnight, Chicago became his kingdom. His business, bootlegging. At its height, Capone's organization pulled in over $100 million a year, smuggling liquor, running speakeasies, and paying off everyone who mattered. Judges, cops, even the mayor. Capone's money reached them all. If the law stood in his way, he bought it. If a rival challenged him, he buried them. His empire wasn't built on business acumen alone. It was enforced with blood. The most infamous example came on Valentine's Day, 1929. 7 members of a rival gang were lined up against a wall in a Chicago garage and mowed down with Tommy guns. The St. Valentine's Day massacre shocked the nation. No charges ever stuck, but the message was clear. Chicago belonged to Capone. The press feasted on the story, and Scarface became the face of organized crime in America. But Capone loved the spotlight too much. While other mobsters stayed in the shadows, Capone posed for photos, gave interviews, and played the part of the charming outlaw. He ran soup kitchens during the Depression, handing out food to the hungry while his men flooded the streets with bootleg liquor. To many, he was a paradox, a killer who smiled, a criminal who cared. Yet in the end, it wasn't bullets that brought him down, it was paperwork. The government couldn't pin murder on him, but they nailed him on tax evasion. In 1931, Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He went from Chicago's untouchable king to inmate at Alcatraz. Behind the walls, his health collapsed. Years of untreated syphilis ate away at his mind, reducing the once feared Scarface to a shell of himself. He died in 1947, just 48 years old, but by then his legend had already eclipsed his life. Al Capone didn't just run Chicago. He turned organized crime into a national obsession, a headline that never faded. And though his empire crumbled, he lit the path for the men who followed, men who would take the Mafia further than Capone ever dreamed. Because while Capone ruled with fear, the next boss would rule with vision. Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who turned chaos into an institution. If Al Capone showed the world how loud organized crime could be, Charles Lucky Luciano showed how smart it could become. He wasn't just another gangster running rackets, he was the architect who built the modern American Mafia. Without Luciano, the mob might have burned itself out in endless street wars. With him, it became an empire. Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily, 1897, and came to New York as a boy. He grew up in the brutal Lower East Side where gangs ruled the streets. But unlike most, Luciano wasn't blinded by loyalty to one neighborhood or one bloodline. He was ambitious, pragmatic, and willing to break traditions if it meant survival. That mindset would change the Mafia forever. By the 1920s, Luciano was working under Joe the Boss Masseria, one of the most powerful mob leaders in New York. But Masseria clung to the old ways, Italians only, Sicilian loyalty above all else. Luciano saw this as weakness. The future wasn't in bloodlines, it was in business. So while he served Masseria, he quietly built ties with Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, and even Irish outfits. This multi-ethnic network gave him more muscle, more money, and more vision than his rivals. Then came the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict between Masseria's gang and a rival faction led by Salvatore Maranzano. Luciano played both sides, biding his time. In 1931, he made his move. Masseria was gunned down in a Coney Island restaurant, allegedly with Luciano setting up the hit. Soon after, Maranzano declared himself boss of bosses, the supreme ruler of the Mafia. But Luciano had no intention of trading one dictator for another. Just months later, Maranzano too was assassinated, and Luciano stood alone, ready to rebuild from the ashes. His solution was revolutionary. Instead of one boss controlling everything, Luciano created the Commission, a board of directors made up of the major crime families. Power was divided, disputes were settled collectively, and wars were bad for business. For the first time, organized crime had structure, rules, and stability. Families became permanent institutions, with bosses acting like CEOs and soldiers like employees. The Mafia wasn't just gangs anymore. It was a corporation. Under Luciano, the mob expanded into unions, construction, narcotics, and gambling. Influence spread into politics, police, and the docks. If you wanted to unload cargo in New York, you paid the mob. If you wanted your union to survive, you listened to them. Luciano blurred the line between the underworld and the legitimate world so effectively that the two became almost indistinguishable. But in 1936, prosecutor Thomas Dewey struck back. Luciano was charged with running prostitution rackets and sentenced to 30-50 years. For most bosses, prison meant the end. For Luciano, it was just another chapter. Even behind bars, his commission kept running, proving the strength of the system he built. Then came World War II. The U.S. Navy needed Mafia connections to secure New York's docks against German sabotage. They turned to Luciano. From prison, he arranged cooperation, ensuring control of the waterfront. In 1946, his sentence was commuted in exchange for his help, but with a condition: exile back to Italy. Luciano never returned to power in the U.S., but his influence never faded. He lived between Naples and Havana, still respected, still pulling strings, until his death in 1960. Lucky Luciano's legacy isn't in the crimes he committed, but in the system he created. He transformed chaos into order, brutality into business, gangs into an institution that would outlast him for decades. Every mob boss who came after Gambino, Gotti, Costello, Genovese, they all played on the stage Luciano built. If Capone was the face of crime, Luciano was its skeleton. And from that skeleton, one man rose to rule like a ghost: Carlo Gambino, the silent Don who controlled everything without saying a word. If Lucky Luciano built the system, Carlo Gambino mastered it. He wasn't flashy like Capone, or ambitious to the point of recklessness like Genovese. He didn't crave headlines or fear. Gambino ruled the Mafia the old Sicilian way, quietly, patiently, and absolutely. In a world where bosses fell to bullets or prison cells, he was the rare Don who lived long enough to die in his own bed. Carlo Gambino was born in Palermo in 1902 and arrived in America in 1921, just as Prohibition turned bootlegging into the crime of the century. He wasn't the strongest man in the room, but he had the qualities that mattered more: caution, loyalty, and the ability to wait. He aligned early with Luciano and Lansky, earning his place by showing he could deliver results without bringing unnecessary heat. While others chased glory, Gambino focused on survival. By the 1930s and 40s, he was a trusted capo in the Mangano crime family, one of New York's 5 families. But power inside the family was volatile. Albert Anastasia, the so-called Lord High Executioner who ran Murder Inc., eventually took control. Anastasia was brutal and unpredictable, feared even among his own men. And in the Mafia, unpredictability was dangerous. In 1957, Anastasia was gunned down while sitting in a Manhattan barbershop chair. The hit cleared the way for Gambino, who quietly stepped into power. Once boss, Gambino restructured the family in his image. Violence was a last resort. Attention from the press or police was poison. His motto was simple: keep things steady, keep things quiet, and keep the money flowing. And it worked. Under his leadership, the Gambino family became the most powerful Mafia family in America. Gambino built his empire, not just with soldiers, but with alliances. He partnered with the Lucchese family to dominate trucking and the garment industry. He extended influence into unions, construction, and shipping docks. If goods moved in or out of New York, chances were Gambino got a cut. Unlike Capone or Gotti, Gambino never gave the public a face to attack. To law enforcement, he was almost invisible, a ghost who ruled everything, but rarely appeared in photos or newspapers. This discretion made him untouchable. While the FBI hunted noisy gangsters, Gambino stayed in the shadows, growing wealth and power. Even the commission, Lucasio's creation, bent naturally toward him. He wasn't boss of bosses by title, but his voice carried more weight than anyone's. When disputes arose, Gambino's word often decided the outcome. He was in every sense the quiet ruler of organized crime, but don't mistake his calm for weakness. Gambino ordered hits with surgical precision, never messy, never traceable. Fear came not from theatrics, but from the knowledge that if you went against him, you would be erased without a ripple. By the 1970s, Gambino's family was the wealthiest and most stable in the Mafia. While others were collapsing under indictments and wars, the Gambinos thrived. Carlo himself managed to avoid prison for nearly his entire reign, and unlike most bosses, he lived to old age. In 1976, Carlo Gambino died of natural causes at his Long Island home, an ending almost unheard of in the underworld. Thousands attended his funeral, a final tribute to the Don who had ruled like a shadow over New York. Gambino's death left a vacuum, and his successors couldn't match his balance of patience and control. But his legacy endured. The Gambino family name became the most famous of the 5 families, and just a few years later, another man would turn that name into a spectacle. If Carlo Gambino was the ghost who ruled unseen, John Gotti was the star who put the Mafia back in the spotlight. If Carlo Gambino ruled in silence, John Gotti ruled in neon lights. He was everything Gambino wasn't: loud, stylish, reckless, and impossible to ignore. To the media, he was the Dapper Don. To the FBI, he was the Teflon Don. To his neighborhood in Queens, he was a folk hero. But to the Mafia, he was the beginning of the end. John Gotti was born in 1940, one of 13 children in a poor Bronx family. He dropped out of school by 16 and found his real education on the streets, hijacking trucks, running scams, and fighting rival crews. Gotti quickly earned a reputation for fearlessness. By the 1970s, he was a trusted soldier in the Gambino family, pulling off bold robberies and earning respect. His rise was fast, fueled by ambition and a willingness to do what others wouldn't. The turning point came in 1985. Paul Castellano, the Gambino boss who had inherited power after Carlo's death, had grown unpopular. Castellano avoided drugs, preferred business suits to street respect, and distanced himself from the soldiers who bled for the family. Gotti saw opportunity. On December 16, 1985, Castellano was shot dead outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. The hit was bold, public, and unmistakably Gotti's play. Days later, he was the new boss of the Gambino family. Unlike Gambino, Gotti loved the spotlight. He wore $1,000 Brioni suits, slicked his hair back, and smiled for the cameras. The press followed him everywhere, dubbing him the Dapper Don. And when he repeatedly beat charges in court, thanks to bribed jurors and intimidated witnesses, he became the Teflon Don, the man nothing could stick to. Crowds cheered for him outside courthouses, treating him like a rock star. For a while, Gotti made being a gangster look glamorous again, but fame came with a cost. The FBI, humiliated by their failures, doubled down. Wiretaps recorded Gotti discussing murders and betrayals. Worse, his own underboss Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano turned informant. Gravano confessed to 19 murders and testified against his boss in exchange for a lighter sentence. In 1992, the untouchable Don was finally touched. Convicted of murder and racketeering, Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The man who once ruled New York's most powerful family was reduced to a prisoner in a federal cell. He died there in 2002, his body broken by cancer, but his name forever etched into Mafia history. John Gotti's reign was short but unforgettable. He brought fame to an organization built on secrecy, and that fame helped destroy it. For the people of Queens, he was a symbol of pride. For law enforcement, he was proof that even the Teflon Don could fall. And for the Mafia, he was the cautionary tale. Power in silence lasts. Power in the spotlight burns. If Gotti was the star who burned too brightly, the next boss on our list chose a different weapon: politics. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, who proved that sometimes an envelope of cash could be stronger than a bullet. Not every Mafia boss ruled with bullets. Some ruled with whispers. Frank Costello was that kind of boss. They called him the Prime Minister of the underworld, because his true power wasn't in guns or soldiers. It was in senators, judges, and city halls, where Capone bought headlines, and Gotti chased fame. Costello bought politicians, and for years it made him one of the most powerful mobsters in America. Born Francesco Castiglia in Calabria, Italy, in 1891, Costello grew up in New York's East Harlem. Like many kids in his neighborhood, he started with petty crimes. But early on he realized something: muscle could only get you so far. Money could take you further. He aligned with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, forming the brain trust that transformed the Mafia from a loose collection of gangs into a business empire. While Luciano built the commission, Costello built the connections. During Prohibition, Costello became the master of distribution. While others fought bloody turf wars, he focused on logistics, ensuring liquor moved smoothly through networks of speakeasies. And he did it with as little noise as possible. Costello wasn't a man of violence, he was a man of influence. He greased the right palms, built bridges with police and politicians, and slowly embedded the Mafia into the fabric of American power. When Luciano was imprisoned in the 1930s, Costello rose higher, eventually becoming the acting boss of the Luciano family. Under his leadership, the mob expanded into gambling, slot machines and unions. His genius wasn't in running rackets, it was in protecting them. Judges dismissed cases, police looked the other way, and lawmakers passed favorable bills. Costello turned corruption into an art form, but power through politics had its risks. In 1951, the Kefauver hearings, televised investigations into organized crime, dragged Costello into the spotlight he had avoided for decades. Millions watched as he dodged questions before a Senate committee. He refused to show his face on camera, only his hands gripping the microphone. The image was haunting, and it shattered his carefully crafted invisibility. To the public, Frank Costello was no longer a shadow, he was the Mafia boss who couldn't hide. The exposure weakened him, and in the Mafia, weakness invites blood. In 1957, rival Vito Genovese made his move. Costello was shot outside his Manhattan apartment, a bullet grazing his head. He survived, but the message was clear. Costello stepped down, leaving Genovese in control. Unlike so many others, he chose retirement over war. Remarkably, Frank Costello lived to old age. He spent his later years as a respected elder of the underworld, still wealthy, still connected, but no longer a target. He died in 1973, not from an assassin's bullet, but from a heart attack. For a Mafia boss, that was almost a miracle. Costello's legacy is subtle, but undeniable. He proved that envelopes of cash could be stronger than Tommy guns. He showed how organized crime could weave itself into politics so deeply that the two became inseparable. And he left behind a lesson: the most dangerous boss isn't always the loudest, it's the one who can make laws bend in his favor. But where Costello built bridges, the man who followed burned them all. Vito Genovese, the tyrant whose hunger for power turned the Mafia against itself. If Frank Costello ruled with influence, Vito Genovese ruled with fear. He wasn't subtle, and he wasn't patient. He was ambitious to the point of self-destruction. A boss who wanted everything, and in chasing it nearly destroyed the Mafia itself. Born in Campania, Italy in 1897, Genovese came to New York as a teenager. He grew up in the same brutal neighborhoods as Luciano and Lansky, and quickly proved himself ruthless. While others thought in terms of alliances, Genovese thought only of himself. Loyalty, tradition, even friendship, none of it mattered if power was on the line. During Prohibition, he became a trusted enforcer under Lucky Luciano, but trust and Vito never mixed. When prosecutors closed in on Luciano in the 1930s, Genovese fled back to Italy rather than risk prison. There he aligned himself with Mussolini's fascist regime, running black market deals and thriving under dictatorship. For the Mafia, it was proof of who he really was, an opportunist who would serve anyone if it kept him alive. After World War II, Genovese returned to America, slipping back into the underworld. By then Luciano was exiled, Costello was rising, and the commission was stable. But stability wasn't enough for Vito. He wanted the crown. He began plotting against Costello, spreading whispers, building allies, and waiting for the right moment. That moment came in 1957. As Costello returned to his Manhattan apartment, a gunman fired, grazing his head. Costello survived, but his reign was finished. Genovese stepped in, renaming the family as his own. Overnight, the Luciano family became the Genovese family, a name it still carries today. But Genovese's ambition didn't stop at one family. He wanted to be boss of bosses, the supreme ruler of the Mafia. To prove his power, he organized the infamous Appalachian Meeting in upstate New York, gathering more than 100 mobsters from across the country. It was meant to be his coronation. Instead, it was a disaster. Police raided the meeting, mobsters fled through the woods, and the Mafia's existence was exposed on a national scale. The secrecy Luciano had built was shattered, and Genovese was to blame. Enemies closed in. In 1959, he was indicted on federal narcotics charges, widely believed to have been orchestrated by other bosses who wanted him gone. He was convicted, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. From his cell, he tried to keep control, issuing orders and demanding loyalty. But paranoia consumed him. He trusted no one, suspected betrayal everywhere, and executed even loyal men. By the time he died in 1969, He was isolated, broken, and forgotten by the empire he once dreamed of ruling. Vito Genovese's legacy is one of ambition without restraint. He reached higher than anyone, but in doing so, brought chaos to the very system Luciano had designed. He proved that betrayal could win you a throne, but not keep it. His family remained powerful, but his personal reign ended in disgrace. With Genovese, the story of the great Mafia bosses comes full circle. From Capone's chaos, to Luciano's order, to Gambino's quiet rule, to Gotti's spectacle, to Costello's diplomacy, and finally Genovese's tyranny, each man shaped the underworld in his own image. Together they defined an era when organized crime was more than crime. It was power, empire, and shadow government. But what do all these stories mean? For that we turn to Don Corleone himself. These men, Capone, Luciano, Gambino, Gotti, Costello, Genovese, they were not simply criminals. They were kings without crowns. Some ruled with guns, others with silence, some with envelopes of cash, and some with ambition that devoured them alive. Each of them carved their names into the bones of America. But remember, nothing built on blood lasts forever. Capone showed the world that chaos could make you rich, but it left him broken. Luciano created order, but exile stole his throne. Gambino proved patience was the sharpest blade, yet even his empire could not escape time. Gotti loved the spotlight, but the spotlight burned him. Costello whispered to senators until betrayal whispered back. And Genovese, he reached too high, only to choke on his own hunger. So take their stories as a lesson. Power is not owned, it is borrowed. Respect is not given, it is taken, and then lost. The world remembers their names, yes, but it also remembers their falls. And that, my friend, is the only truth of the underworld.